everyone, thank you for coming to my presentation today. My name is Leonard and I'm a second-year master's student at Simon Fraser University, and today I will be addressing the question, do female-specific social interactions influence breeding phenology of European starlings? This question is one component of my current research project investigating the supplemental cues that fine-tune timing of egg laying, with temperature and prey availability being the other cues I focus on. I will briefly introduce temperature, however, my main focus today will be on female social networks. I study European starlings, which are social birds that exhibit highly synchronous breeding behaviors, with 80% of the population of starlings at our long-term study site, Davisstead Farm, initiating egg laying within just 4 days of each other. Timing of egg laying by females has important consequences when it comes to fitness, as seasonal availability of food is often limited, so it is important females accurately predict, often weeks to months in advance, when resources will be most abundant at the time of chick rearing. Photoperiod provides the initial predictive information needed to initiate seasonal reproductive development and may be the only information needed by males to reach reproductive readiness. However, in females, the final stages of gonadal maturation occur just before onset of egg laying. For example, female European starlings initiate rapid yolk development only 5 days before egg laying, and females are thought to use supplemental cues to fine-tune timing of egg laying to their local environment. Temperatures predict laying date in European starlings, as in many birds, as demonstrated by Williams et al. In their 2015 paper. I reran sliding window analysis with 7 additional years of temperature and laying date data, and found that January 1st through March 31st temperatures, a 90-day window, predict laying date. However, there is still substantial annual residual variation, ranging from birds laying 4 days earlier than predicted to 3 days later than predicted by temperature. This is what I seek to understand in my project, and this is what underlies my question, does variation in female social networks help explain annual residual variation in laying date? To address this question, I first constructed an ArcGIS online map using GPS points taken at each nest box, and used this to create a distance key, recording measurements out to the 12 nearest boxes for each of the 150 boxes at the farm. Then, I combined first clutch initiation data from years 2013 to 2021 that includes nest box location and number, absolute laying date, residual laying date, and the female occupant of each box. Using the distance key as reference, I added nearest neighbor distances out to neighbor 7 with the box number and band number of the female occupants. I calculated mean distance data to neighbors 1, 1 through 3, 7, and 1 through 7 for analysis, but these are highly correlated, and today I will focus on data from the nearest 7 neighbors. Here is a map showing what our study site, Davisstead Farm in Langley, BC, looks like. Yellow dots indicate nest boxes, and pink dots are where I took soil samples to examine prey availability, which I will not be talking about today. Our locations are categorized as main field, which is a linear habitat, and 2 clustered habitats on different ends of the farms, which are the new barn and old barn. As I indicated earlier, in addition to variation in residual laying date, we do see coarse scale, temporal, and spatial variation in female social networks, which we will characterize further using nearest neighbor distances 1 through 7, residency, and familiarity of neighboring females. If social networks indeed influence timing of egg laying, then we'd expect to see annual and female-specific variation in laying date co-vary with respect to these predictor variables. So for our first question, does annual variation in laying date co-vary with annual variation of neighbor distances? As a reminder, here is the mean residual laying date in years I analyzed network data, which includes 2013 to 2021, and our analysis show that mean distances to neighbors 1 through 7 do not co-vary across years. Does nearest neighbor distances and laying date co-vary by breeding location? As a reminder, new barn and old barn have clustered nest boxes, and main field has a linear structure. So, perhaps not surprisingly, mean nearest neighbor distances are much greater in the linear habitat, with a threefold increase in neighbor distances than the old barn. Despite this difference in spatial structure, residual laying date and nearest neighbor distances do not co-vary with breeding location. Although we see individual variation in nearest neighbor distances, this does not explain within-year residual variation in laying date. In addition to nearest neighbor 1 through 7 distances, we examined if residency and female familiarity are associated with variation in laying date. This plot shows residency distribution, or the number of times resident females occupied a box in successive years. Although most females only use a nest box in a single year, 21% use a nest box in at least 2 consecutive years, and some up to 6 years. This lower graph shows familiarity data, defined as the number of returning females in the nearest 7 nests, or how many familiar neighbors a female has. Here we see strong network structures with over 50% of females being familiar with at least 2 of their neighbors. So, does variation in female residency explain residual variation in laying date? First, annual residual temperature independent variation in laying date is independent of annual mean residency of the population. Then we examine the relationship at an individual level using residuals of year-specific means, grouping residency over 3 as 3+ due to the small sample size. This graph shows that females do not adjust their relative laying date with increasing residency. Does variation in female familiarity explain residual variation in laying date? Again, we first look at annual familiarity, and this does not explain annual temperature-independent variation in laying date, though we do see a trend of later laying with higher familiarity. Additionally, females do not adjust their relative laying date in response to increasing familiarity of neighbors. In summary, we found evidence of strong structure in European starling social networks, but this did not covary with laying date. Specifically, laying date is independent of mean 1 through 7 neighbor distances at both the annual and individual level, despite strong location variation in neighbor distances. 79% of known females have low residency, and annual residual laying date is independent of mean residency time. Finally, annual residual laying date is independent of mean female familiarity, despite familiarity ranging from 1 to 5 neighbors, though there is a trend with later laying associated with increasing familiarity. My next steps are to further analyze within-year variation, network familiarity and synchrony and laying date, map individual networks, and examine the results from our female call playback experiment conducted in spring of 2021. And with that, I would like to thank everyone listed on the slide, and of course birds for just being birds, and I will take any questions you may have. Thank you.